very excited to have people joining us today to hear another one of our fantastic presentations. This is our 5th U.S. Center at the United Nations Framework Convention Conference of the Parties, and we are very happy to be here again and seeing some familiar faces in the crowd. My name is Amanda McCarty, and I will be your MC for today's event. For those of you who are visiting our center for the first time, we'd like you to know that the U.S. Center is a public diplomacy effort sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. It's used to highlight efforts by the United States, both domestically and abroad, that are aimed at understanding, adapting to, and combating climate change. We've had a great time in Warsaw thus far and have more interesting presentations ahead of us, so we hope you enjoy the talk today and come back for additional presentations. Right now, we are fortunate to have an excellent panel focused on accelerating the transition to clean energy through the Clean Energy Ministerial. This event is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy. We all know that to tackle the incredibly complex problem of climate change, we must transition to a clean energy economy. The Clean Energy Ministerial is a forum of the world's major economies working together to do just that. This presentation will highlight the results that have already been realized through the Ministerial, work that is taking place to accelerate progress, and perspectives from the U.S. and around the world. From the U.S. perspective, we will hear about the contributions this effort is making to the implementation of President Obama's Climate Action Plan. Today we will be hearing from Jonathan Pershing. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Change and the Principal Deputy Director for the Office of Energy Policy in the U.S. Department of Energy. You may all know him because prior to joining the Department of Energy, Jonathan served as the Deputy Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State. He also worked as Director of the Climate, Energy, and Pollution Prevention Program at the World Resources Institute and led the Energy and Environment Division at the International Energy Agency in Paris. He holds a PhD in Geology and Geophysics from the University of Minnesota and has published and lectured widely on energy and climate issues. He also served as a lead author and review editor for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are also joined today by Joan McNorton, Executive Chair of the World Energy Trilemma. She has also served in a variety of energy-related roles, including Director General of Energy for the United Kingdom, Chair of the Governing Board of the International Energy Agency, Vice Chair of the High-Level Panel for the Clean Development Mechanism Policy Dialogue, and as Global Advisor on Sustainable Policies for Alstom. We may also be joined today by Kadri Nassiep, CEO of the South African National Energy Development Institute. So with that, I will turn it over to our panel to begin the discussion.
Thanks very much, Amanda. It's great to be here. It's always interesting to try to do a presentation on the day that the session begins because everyone's crashing on developments, on negotiations. So hopefully people who are here will have a chance to listen to this, but there'll also be an opportunity to follow up for those who'd like more information. A lot of this information is on the website. There's a great deal going on. And in some ways, I want to highlight really one significant fact about our process. There are multiple strands of work that are going to be critical to solving the climate change problem. The work that we do in the Climate Convention is overarching. It's all-encompassing. It really picks up the broad spectrum of tasks and activities. But if it doesn't catalyze other work, other more specific operations and tasks, it will not be effective. One of those additional things that I think in some ways was catalyzed by this process are a series of other ministerial processes and programs, often more targeted, maybe within one single sector, which are trying to drive forward emissions reductions that we're going to need if we're going to solve this climate change problem. And this presentation is a report on one of those activities. A number of years ago, we put together an exercise to bring the major economies of the world through their energy ministers, not their climate ministers or their environment ministers or their foreign ministers, but their energy ministers together to try to address the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that would be possible through a clean energy transformation. And the work I'm going to present today is a reflection of the last several years of that initiative and what we've gotten to so far. So let me start off with a couple of pictures. So the question really is how you can have an impact. And at the end of the day, one of the kinds of things you might like to do is to avoid building new power plants. In this instance, what the Clean Energy Ministerial has done is looked at on the order of avoiding 90 coal-fired power plants, affecting, give or take, about 250 million tons of CO2. And so what you end up with this one initiative, this one project, we now have a process in which, through a series of low-emitting, light-emitting diodes, highly efficient LED lamps, we can do exactly that. This LED project alone, give or take some, about 90 coal-fired power plants represented here. 277 terawatt hours of energy. Kind of think about scaling one project, taking a number of ministries, a number of countries, support at a very high level in a major economy, yielding these kinds of changes. Here's another example, another impact. 6.9 million people. Those are the number of people who can get health benefits from a somewhat different proposal, off-grid lighting. If you kind of think about now how the lighting system works in a lot of Africa, what you end up with is fires. You end up with kerosene lamps. You end up with high indoor air quality problems, significant opportunities now for new technologies that we might be able to move forward on. 1.4 million of these bulbs, 6.9 million people with a different lifestyle. Really, you can see the consequences of scaling up if you can drive those kinds of changes. One last example before I kind of launch into some of the pieces. 2.3 million tons of CO2, 3 terawatt hours of electricity every year. In this particular instance, cool roofs. Something pretty simple. An idea that basically says, instead of keeping your roof dark, you put some light-coated color on it, and it reflects more of the sunlight that you've got. And what you end up with is an action plan here being done in Mexico, one of our partners. What you've got is only 3 cities so far, which is the beginning, we hope, of a much, much larger effort. 3.3 million terawatts, just this project, 2.3 million tons. All of this takes an enormous amount of energy. It takes political energy. It takes willingness to act. It moves away from the paradigm that's being set here into the implementation of the paradigm, which is the responsibility of ministers and ministries in the energy sector, sometimes with local actors at the heart of where we are going. So what do they all have in common? If we take a look at where we're going, basically, this is the Clean Energy Ministerial's job. This is what we're trying to deliver and where we're going. And this is just a small fraction of the benefits that we've got as we try to move forward. Overall objectives of the Clean Energy Ministerial: increase energy efficiency, expand the clean energy supply, and enhance clean energy access. 3 broad goals: the goals that speak to the climate arena, the goals that clearly speak to the sustainability arena, and the goals that speak to the economic arena. At the end of the day, we can do this at an affordable price and in a way that improves people's lives, and that makes it a very compelling story, and one that we really hope to see adopted as we go forward. So let me talk a little bit about what kind of benefits we get, first looking at energy efficiency. And this particular graph that you see is a potentials graph. It was done as part of an analysis for one of the initiatives that we've got, which is on efficient appliances. The exercise is, if you think through where our energy is going, and you just look at this room as an example, and you look at the lights, and look at the air conditioning, and look at the ventilation systems, and you, in fact, it's kind of chilly outside, you think about the heating systems, 40% of electricity goes into building uses, heating, cooling, lighting, air conditioning. You can drive an unbelievable change in this sector with a series of activities. So what we've got here is in the red. That's the quantity of energy potential. That's currently what's being used. The potential savings in this area, about 500 terawatts just in heating and air conditioning. Look at the orange line, that's lighting, includes ventilation, fans. The next one over is refrigeration. The next one over beyond that, you get a whole series of motors and televisions and water heating, standby power, cooking. These numbers are what we could do if we act sufficiently and adequately on this. If you take a look at what the numbers would add up to, we like to use a kind of an analogy for it. This represents about 650 coal-fired power plants. It's not a bad number. That's a really serious number. You start thinking about this begins to put a dent in the total production that we've now got in our fossil fuel sector just from these kinds of efficiencies, these kinds of programs. The question really is, how do you deliver on those kinds of questions? And the savings, 11 billion tons of CO2, and the savings, give or take some, $1 trillion over 2 decades. So the value is economic, the value is social, the value is certainly in the context of climate change. We haven't gotten very far yet. This top graph shows where we are currently in the activities that we've got underway. And what they, to me, suggest is that we're not doing too badly on the heating and the air conditioning, but we've got a long way to go if we're trying to get into lighting. Not quite there at the scale we need to be, but we have the beginnings of a series of policies, of projects, of programs that are beginning to get us to this kind of scale. That's the intent of the ministerial. This is one of a dozen different initiatives that are trying to scale things up in that way. So let's look first at cool surfaces. This is the Cool Roofs program. Let's see if I can get this to go. This is the emissions savings that we can get. The 3 cities is in red. The remainder is what we could get if we go to the blue. My little clicker seems to be slow. This is what we can get if we do pavements as well. At the moment, most of our pavements are quite dark. Could you move it forward and end up with light-colored pavements, more reflective pavements? You can get a whole host of additional gigatons there. What you see here is almost 30 gigatons from pavements alone. It's just an example of where we are. These are the countries that are playing in this set of initiatives. And what you see is there are 23 governments that are participating. Collectively, they represent over 90% of global energy investment and over 80% of global emissions. So this is not meant to be everybody's participating. This is a smaller group. It's a group that can sit around a table. It's a group that if they sit around the table and really focus on some key tasks, can make a difference that would be felt globally. And it's not exclusive. It doesn't mean that other people can't take advantage of the thinking and the work that's being done here. There are lots of other partners that we work with who are not in this particular list, who are certainly engaged in both our work and benefiting from some of the thinking that we've done as we benefit from some of the thinking that they have done. The strategy is in 3 domains, 3 different things. 1, a high-level policy dialogue. That's kind of like what we do here. The ministerial element of this seeks to drive political action. If you can get a minister to play, if you can get a minister to engage, then you get their ministry. If you get their ministry, you can get their people and their technical expertise. You can often get their financial support. You can get their policy engagement. Technical cooperation. A lot of these things are things that we know how to do, or at least somebody knows how to do, but it hasn't been transferred very well. It hasn't been communicated very effectively. And part of the dynamic of this process is to use the collation of people and bring together a collaborative exercise to exchange information. And finally, one of the things that's really specific to this process that many of us have tried in other fora is to engage the private sector. The presumption among these countries is that the kind of areas in which we are engaging are very heavily dominated by private investment. And the key here is to catalyze that, to scale that up. And part of the way you do that is to engage the players, understand what they need so that your policy process can yield the kinds of incentives, can create the kind of guidance, might be regulatory, might be market-based, that pushes that constituency into the kinds of activities that we're seeking. So those are the areas, and we meet and convene across those kinds of programs going forward. So the strategy then is distributed leadership. It's not just one particular list of players. It really moves along. Every one of our initiatives has got country co-leads. We don't have a negotiated text, so in that sense, it's quite a distinct exercise from this. It's a technical process. It's a process of information exchange, not a process of negotiation. Collaboration is across the board, multilateral institutions, bilateral plays between individual partners, public and private, and it's voluntary and collaborative. It's not something you have to do. You join because you see a value. You participate because there's a return. If you don't like it, you don't work on that initiative. But the collection of actions has been so far both interesting, looks to be rather effective, potentially significant in terms of scale. Certainly the opportunity is there to deliver at quite a large level. So this is the structure we've got. Basically, you can see where it is. It's in these 4 boxes. One box is in energy efficiency. There's a box in what we call clean energy, one in the integrating elements, and one under human capacity. And as you take a look at these, under the efficiency, we've got that appliance piece that I was talking about. That was the graphic that showed the potentials. But we've also got a piece that's more narrowly in the buildings efficiency side. We collaborate with some other programs in this. We've got some names for some of the institutional organizations. The name for this initiative is the Global Sustainable Energy Efficiency Program. That's GSEP. That's what it stands for. It's the initiative title. Clean energy includes solar and wind, hydropower, bioenergy, and carbon capture and storage. If we can get that model in, we can really change the system and really shift over to a different structure. Integration is about things that are not narrowly in one fuel or one subsector, but they're about the crossover. For example, and I'll talk about this in a moment, the 21st Century Energy Power Partnership is a vision around how you integrate renewables into your grid at scale. But it brings in questions about how the transmission system works. It looks into the questions of the end use and how you can manage load. All of those things have to be integrated if what you want to do is have an efficient, low-cost, and clean system. It's not about the individual area of solar or wind. It's about how you tie that into a system at scale. And finally, one of the things that this group has really tried to do, in part because of the urgency and the importance of sustainability and sustainable development, is has a very large human dimension. And in particular, it's around capacity building. How do you get information to people, particularly people who have often not been in the heart of the energy development regime? So we've got one on something called the Clean Energy Solutions Center. It's essentially a group of experts from around the world who are available for policymakers in governments who want to get information. Ask an expert. And the people who have been using it are about 80 governments around the world who have a new vision of what they want to try to do but don't have the information about the implementation. They can call into this center and they can get a person or people who will answer their questions and work with them. It's like a free consultant, but the person who's on the other end is a government official who's been working on that problem often for decades. So you've got deep expertise available to the policy-making community around the world for this kind of new development. Another one. Turns out that in the vast majority of developing countries, the people who use energy the most are the people who are least involved in its production or distribution. It's women. How can you get more women into the system? We've got an entire initiative thinking about how to elevate that community's capacity, how to bring them in, how to create training programs, how to create mentoring programs. So over the course of the next few years, we can actually have a constituency which not only uses the energy, but knows how to deliver the energy and knows how to deliver it with a cleaner footprint. We've also got one that really is about access in a different way. One of the things you see, particularly in Africa, is really an inadequate capacity. You don't even have lights in a lot of places. All of you have seen those space images. We had them up on the big screen earlier about what the Earth looks like from night. And at that point, it really is a darker continent. And how do you think about providing lighting, but at a cost we can afford? This initiative is about that part of the deal. This is about low cost, but significantly lower emissions lighting through an LED system. So this is the structure that we've got going forward. And this is a bit hard to see. Mostly you get a sense that the participation here is quite wide. You've got the list of initiatives down the left-hand column, the countries, the 23 countries across the top, and you can see that most countries are involved in many, many of the initiatives. No one's involved in every initiative. Everyone's involved in a number of initiatives. And the idea here is that one size doesn't fit everybody, but everybody's interested in doing something, and they're all interested in doing something significant and real, and this flexibility has made it very attractive. It's much easier to play if you don't have to do everything, but you can do those things that are relevant to your economy, relevant to your economic development, relevant to your growth. The United States is in a number of these. These are the ones that we actually lead. So you can see we lead on a number of different pieces. And this next one, these are the ones that we're in, but that we actually don't lead, that others are leading, that we're actively participating in. We're actually not doing bioenergy. I think we'll probably start doing some work on sustainable cities. It's not that we don't do bioenergy. We have a big program on that. It's just we didn't have the people at the point this was designed to actually devote that resource there. Brazil's leading on that, and I think there's some interesting work going on. Interestingly enough, the UAE is leading on sustainable cities, and I think there's an enormously interesting evolution of this process. You think about currently where we are in the urban-rural demographic. The world is moving to cities. How do you think about building more sustainable communities? I think we're going to play in that initiative. It's a big part of, I think, all of our future as we go forward. So having an impact. This is the Ask the Expert service. I talked about them. More than 100 requests now. Policy assistance. Does some really quite significant things. This is the 21st Century Power Partnership. Peer-to-peer engagement. Does a whole series of things about integrating renewables, expanding smart grids, really looking at energy efficiency at a system-wide scale, which is much greater than what you can achieve if you look at an appliance or even look at a building. This integration of systems provides enormous windows and enormous potential for a great deal of development. This is the Global Superior Energy Performance Standard. That's that appliance efficiency piece that I was talking about a moment ago. A whole series of case studies. You can get anywhere up to a 25 or 26% efficiency and improvement that we're seeing from existing projects that are being carried forward by the groups working on this process. This is the Women in Energy. We've got a series of leadership programs, a series of what we're calling ambassadors, people who are going out and talking in the community about what we can do to bring women more actively into the community, an awards program, and an annual symposium. One of the things we've found is that one of the reasons people get better at their jobs is they get to talk to their peers. And for many women, particularly rural community women, women who are in countries which don't have that kind of regular forum, this offers that opportunity, and the energy at these meetings is fabulous. And you kind of see people going home and coming back the next year and telling amazing stories about what they've been able to do, and it's mostly that interaction that has generated that new enthusiasm and new information that was just not accessible prior to these kind of conversations. What we've got here, this is the Smart Grid program. It's a separate piece. It's a whole exercise looking at the technologies that we require in order to move forward on smart grids globally. You've got a whole series of countries that are involved. The idea is to do a database of things that work. We end up with a whole series of projects, 17 different countries with almost 100 projects already underway. Everything from the design of phaser systems that work on how you move energy back and forth at very rapid periods to things like how you think about end use and ability to ramp up and ramp down supply. All of that being applied under the Smart Grid program. This is the Solar and Wind Working Group. One of the things we've been doing is using some of our abilities, other labs around the world. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory at the Department of Energy, a key player in this, has been working on mapping the global resource, an atlas essentially of what is available, where you can go, where you might think of siting your wind turbine, what the solar installation looks like if you're looking at a global level and want to narrow it down to where a site-specific opportunity would exist. This is public. It's available online. Investors can look at it. Countries can look at it. Policymakers can look at it. Product developers can look at it. And you now have much more information at your fingertips as you're looking about where you go and in what areas you might choose to invest. So this technical cooperation, South Africa is going to say a few words about this. These are the ones that South Africa is actively playing in. I'll just speak for them because I don't think they're able to make it to this particular meeting. So you had just a brief set of what things they were working on. You can see they're in almost everything as well. It's pretty consistent across the board. Most countries are in at least half, if not more, of all the initiatives that are underway. And they've got a whole series of private sector engagement that they've really been working on. And we've got a series of roundtables that they've engaged in that their private sector players and the private sector players from around the world have been participating in. Things like clean energy and vehicle adoptions. How do you look at that? One of the things that we have, for example, is the Chinese are leading on an electric vehicle program. We're actively partnering with them. They've done extraordinary things in terms of battery development. They've been looking into the questions about how you do fueling stations. A whole series of the pieces that are required to move forward in an electric vehicle fleet that could then be powered with clean energy are part of a solution for the transport sector. Really significant activity there and huge private sector interest from some of the major automobile manufacturers around the world. Policy and finance. One of the players who comes into this system is the Bloomberg New Energy Finance community. Their interest essentially is in tracking and monitoring the investment in these clean energy areas. And what we're seeing is an enormous interest and a growing interest from the people like Goldman Sachs, from the JP Morgans, from the Citibanks, from the players at JBIC, from the people in the Brazilian investment community. We're seeing a new and increasing interest in where this is going to go because there are real returns on investment to be had, and this kind of information stimulates that development. We're seeing a whole question around soft costs. One of the things that we know in the renewable sector, particularly in the power grid sector, is that we have brought the price of an individual solar panel down by almost a factor of 100 over the last 25 years. But we have had stubbornly high, what we call soft costs. What does it cost to license that thing? How do you know it's going to work, and can you get a cohort of trained people to maintain your facility? Those prices are not coming down fast enough. The leaders in this, Denmark and Germany, doing some really interesting work around common standards that they've developed in the country to bring those soft costs down. The US has had some success. We're still almost twice as high as those two countries, but you look at other parts of the world and they're 10 times as high. Information in this kind of initiative can drive those costs down so we can all take advantage of the low-price solar panel and not have them not work. They'll operate at low cost, they'll be effective, they'll be reliable. Mini-grid development. huge area of interest in terms of the process. How do you think about the elaboration of where you might be headed in the future? For many places, the idea of a centralized system is not going to work and may not be worth the cost. You may have a smaller community with somewhat lower requirements. You don't need to have a 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant. You could deal with it if you had a much smaller distributed generation system. This initiative, in which the South Africans are actively playing, does exactly that, thinking through how you manage townships, what do you do in the rural parts of the country. You can't necessarily always be connected to the grid, and you may not want to be. Here are some opportunities and alternatives. So there are a lot of benefits. The collective activity that we're hoping to get to is about that 650 power plants over the next 20 years is kind of a metric that we often use. Clearly does an enormous amount in the way of reducing emissions. It helps us deploy renewables. It helps us look at efficiency. It helps support women, the whole notion of engagement. It helps facilitate best practices. That's the kind of larger vision in this particular process. And that's the exercise here about accelerating where we're trying to go. We need more government participation, though. At the end of the day, we don't have enough. We need to have more resources. At the end of the day, we still don't have enough. We need a bit more ambitious action within the initiatives. You saw the potential, and you saw what we've got, and there's a gap there still. Ambition would be nice in this area. And we need to have individual countries try to take this up. At the end of the day, you could have a wonderful forum, a great meeting, and people will come and will be enthusiastic, and they go home and there's another priority. And you have to think about how to make this the priority when they go home. And part of that is the process of engagement. And part of that is the fact that others are succeeding. And part of the fact is the examples and the demonstration effect that we've got. And scaling that up is the agenda and the objective going forward with our process. So if you want to follow it up, here is the slides. They're available here. There's a lot of information on the individual initiatives that's available on the web. All of us are very happy to talk about it, not only at DOE, but in almost all the partner countries. We see a huge potential in this kind of process. So let me turn it over to Joan, who has been one of our stalwart participants from the private sector as we've moved forward. I think she's got some broad comments about both work that she's done in the private sector, and she's been deeply involved in thinking about this initiative as we've worked over the last 4 years. So thanks very much, and Joan, you have the floor.
Right. Well, now for something a little different. The short, fat one in the pink on the one of the slides that Jonathan showed. Everybody else is in black and white, and there's a pink back. But the way the camera angle, that's what I tell myself, made me look like the short, fat one. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jo McNorton, and I have been engaged with the Clean Energy Ministerial in a sequence of different roles, actually. I was asked to engage with the initiative on women, which I was delighted to do. When I went to be Director General of Energy in the United Kingdom, I was absolutely astonished. Felt as if I'd gone back in time from the other sectors I'd worked in. Often the only woman in the room in 2002 and beyond, and often the most senior person in the room, but still the only woman. And that, I think, says a lot. And that's in a country where we had made quite a lot of progress with getting women into professional, senior professional roles. So I think the capacity building potential there is absolutely huge. Jonathan mentioned the energy. I have to say, you come out floating because of the stories and the enthusiasm you hear from these people. And those stories are not about emotion. The energy comes from actually what they're achieving and what they've delivered. So I think this is, I would pay every tribute to the DOE for the leadership they've shown in that initiative and the continuing commitment they have to it right from the top right through the department. But what's unique about the Clean Energy Ministerial, Jonathan mentioned sort of several different aspects of it, but it brings together the private sector and ministers in a problem-solving capacity. So the private sector come along and you're not lectured at by the ministers or given the political spin. You sit round a table together and you crunch a problem. Now, for sure, there'll be some lead discussants and all that kind of thing. But you look at a problem All contributions are valid. It's interdisciplinary, so you'll often have somebody who's a technical energy expert on that matter. But you might have someone who's political, social, someone from the finance community. And what this does is enable you actually to think about some of the codependencies that are often overlooked by a policymaker looking at their own single dossier, that are overlooked by somebody looking at it from the point of view, completely legitimately, what does my company bring to the table here and what do I need to take away? So that opens the discussion and it makes it more creative, and we get into areas and some findings which you wouldn't necessarily expect. And I have always been a fan of bringing business in. From my time in government, I was 35 years in government, and I always found that if I was doing something that impacted on business, to get them in and talk to them about it actually helped me to understand what we needed to do and how to avoid the unintended consequences. And sometimes that was not easy. And I think it's fair to say that the momentum has built from the early days in the Clean Energy Ministerial, because when you start, people are not completely convinced that they're there for that open, textured discussion, and you need to build the trust that that is so. And officials and ministers need to build their capability of how to stimulate and use the right product of that discussion. When I moved into the private sector, I spent 5 years in business after leaving the UK government, I was astonished at how different the policy-making process looked, how difficult it was for people in business to understand sometimes even the language of the policymakers. Now, this varies in each country, but I had a global role, so I saw it in many, many different countries. And what I felt was that bringing people together initially, you don't see a lot of result because you're actually learning how to talk to one another. You have to stick with these processes. You have to centre them round something concrete, as the Clean Energy Ministerial has done, because otherwise, why do the participants continue to make that investment? But if you do those two things, then you begin to derive some very real and concrete benefits from them. So I, at the last Clean Energy Ministerial, moderated one of the roundtables bringing private sector and ministers and policymakers together. And it was about this whole issue of integrating renewables into the power system. And we had very senior ministers, up to and including Secretary Chu. We had very senior private sector people from a whole range of disciplines. And we looked at this problem, which of course is going to be one of the big challenges in the energy transition for some decades to come. And the group came up with some recommendations. They stressed the need for an integrated approach, a plan, a master plan for each country to where you want to get to, and how you actually ensure you maximise your ability and keep costs down, as well as ensuring that you move to lower emissions. And that needs to encompass par excellence energy efficiency in appliances, as we've heard, but also all the way through the value chain from the end use right up to and back into the power station and right across the whole supply of energy and services. And critical to it is the flexibility and ability of the system to respond. And regulations governing these systems are not necessarily designed at the moment to allow for this flexibility, because we're moving from one paradigm eventually to another, and we're in this mixed paradigm at the moment with big base load and a lot of distributed coming onto the system with the kind of thermal power plant, but now lots more renewables, with just beginning to make real progress on smart grids and so forth. So the system has to be governed by frameworks that not only don't impede flexibility, but actually allow for and encourage it. And I think there's work to be done on what those policy frameworks need to look like if that's what you're going to achieve. But as we move through to this new paradigm, you're going to see completely different relationships between the consumer, between the operators of the system, between the suppliers of the power, the generators, and indeed the regulators and the policymakers. And I think one of the insights we had was that actually you're going to have quite a transformation of the business models of a lot of the commercial people in that area, and that has to be accompanied by and driven by the right changes to regulations. So you're going to have a journey here where the public and private sector have to go along together. So that takes me to my last point to share with you. I've been leading some work for the World Energy Council on what we call the trilemma, and that's assessing how well countries' energy policies enable them to deliver against the three goals of energy policy, that is to say, energy security, supplying the energy when people need it, energy access and affordability, which we call energy equity, that's the second goal of the trilemma, and the third is environmental sustainability, which par excellence is about the impact on emissions and on climate change, but goes beyond that to look also at environmental pollution. All countries struggle to balance these three. The work that the Clean Energy Ministerial is driving, in the way Jonathan described it, looks at all three. It looks at the economic, it looks at the social and the affordability, and it looks at the emissions impact. So that very much chimes with what we've been measuring and analysing for some years now. And we try to produce insights which the policymakers will find helpful. And in 2012, we interviewed nearly 50 global CEOs with a cumulative turnover of billions and billions, who came back to us with some very clear messages about what they wanted from the policymakers. And this year we interviewed the policymakers, including people from the UNFCCC, IEA, and individual ministers and officials in country. And they recognised the need for the kind of policy frameworks which our energy sector business leaders had described in 2012, and made some recommendations of their own to business about business getting more engaged in developing these policy frameworks, in helping to make sure that they were the sort of frameworks that would drive investment, because the investment challenge is absolutely huge here. And we have constructed an action plan which will help, in parallel with some of the work the Clean Energy Ministerial is doing, to drive forward more investment, to get the understanding of the interdependencies between those three goals of energy policy, recognising that energy is central to climate change is central to energy, and you can't look at only one aspect of this policy. You have to look at them all together. Otherwise, you're not sustainable. You don't have durable policy framework, and you don't have durable results in what you're trying to achieve. So I'm looking forward to discussing further the processes and the experiences of the Clean Energy Ministerial, which I think is a great initiative. What it does is it in a concrete way, it gives a forum for that business and policymaker dialogue, which we've identified as absolutely crucial to meeting the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joan. It's actually been great both to have you here, but probably even more to have you doing what you're doing. It's really been a pleasure. You, I think, got some sense of the kind of diversity in our community, but also the depth in our community from some of the work that Joan's talked about. We've got about 15 minutes. Very happy to take questions. People may have some things they'd like to raise, comments they'd like to make. We've got a microphone, so please, before you ask your question, give us your name and your affiliation, and we're open for business. So please, anybody who have any questions? Don't all leap at once, please.
My name is Chris Wolfe. I'm a University of Michigan graduate student. And I just had a question from the standpoint of sort of funding this program in terms of U.S. specifically. And sort of, I came in a little late. I'm not sure if you touched on when it began, but sort of, you know, the turnover administration to administration. Obviously, we have a president right now who believes in climate change and who believes in addressing that issue. But, you know, who's to say what happens in 2016 or 2020? Are there mechanisms in place to ensure that you know, these programs, at least in the U.S., continue to be funded, or sort of how is it set up and what is the framework in place at the moment?
Thanks very much. There are a couple of just general ways this is done. The first thing is that, as many of you probably know, particularly if you follow U.S. policy, there's very little that you can do to assure that a program will continue from one administration to another. The budget is an annual or a biannual exercise in some cases, but almost always an annual exercise with approval from the U.S. Congress. And as a consequence, Congress can decide from one year to another that it wants to engage in something and start it up, or from one year to another decide it wants to stop and shut it down. So it's very difficult to do it. It's been actually an issue for the United States in some of our international activities. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to try two things. The first one is on the domestic side, the second is on the international side. Domestically, one of the things we've tried to do is to build a large constituency for it. And there's actually quite a lot of bipartisan interest in the kinds of things that we are doing. We've taken on, in many cases, areas that people think have promise, that people think are good for us as a country, and that we play a constructive role in the global community. And there's actually a lot of interest in that from both sides. So that's a key part of the long-term success. The second one is by the international community. One of the things that we've tried to do here is to say we can't own this. We have to be a partner in this. We need others to also co-own this. And by doing that, there's a sense that it's not us pushing the world, it's the world collectively pushing itself forward. And that framework is often much more interesting for us to stay with, even if we're no longer quite as committed to the process. The last thing I would say is that I couldn't agree with you more about my president. I think he's doing fabulous work. But I think that the world is changing a bit in the U.S. If I take a look at popular opinion, it reached a low about 4 years ago. We were down below 50% of people who thought this was a serious problem. It's now well above 70%. And I think that that dynamic is going to play a really big difference in how we engage going forward. I don't believe we'll slow down. I think if anything, we'll continue to speed up. Please, other questions?
So my name's Nick, and I'm a graduate student with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the Department of Political Science at UCSD. My question for you relates to the value of a carbon tax in driving the incentives that kind of underlie the success of your organization, and whether or not you think that that would be a valuable tool in pushing future success, both within the U.S. and in other nations.
So I know that Joan herself has done a lot of thinking about pricing. I'll say just 2 words and then turn it over to her. I think the answer is yeah. If you had a price, it would make a big difference. It doesn't mean it's the only way to make a difference, though. And it doesn't mean that you have to wait till you have a price to do those other things. So in my mind, the question is, how do you move now? How much more could you move if you could do that? How do you try to create prices of all sorts? They come in a variety of ways, explicit and implicit, carbon markets, regulatory structures, actual pricing mechanisms, a lot of ways to get there. Some of the US states are doing that. So there's a lot of solutions to this problem. I think a price would make it easier, but it's not that you can't act without it, and we are in fact acting without it. Joan?
Thanks, Jonathan. I note that you were careful to talk about a carbon price rather than a tax per se. I think I'd like to pick up on that, because I absolutely agree that we've got to move to a price, and hopefully a global price. And Achim Steiner from UNEP this morning said that if you costed, even at quite a low assumed level, the carbon impact which the cement industry is having, then the whole cement industry will be running at a terrible loss. So we're all subsidizing it, frankly. And we'll pay for it at some point, or our children will pay for it, or people in coastal regions will pay for it. So we need to do that. The question is whether that should be a tax or a cap and trade and a traded price in the market. I favour trading, and I favour trading because I think a tax is too vulnerable to the point inherent in the previous question, which is changes in political fashion in country. And certainly in the UK, you would never know from one year to the next what the level of tax was going to be, because it would depend on other drivers, political drivers around the budget in that country. And that, I think, makes long-term planning difficult. Although there are problems with the European Emissions Trading Scheme, Phase 3 was set to run from 2013 to 2020, so people knew there would be a price for 7 years. Now, those problems there were some design flaws, but the main problems have come from the impact of other policy initiatives which have not been fully worked out. So whatever system you introduce, tax or trade, you have to think about its interrelation with other policies that you're taking forward. And so that's one point I would make. But the other reason I favour the cap and trade approach is that you can move to a situation where you can have trading between countries, so you can do mitigation at lowest economic cost earlier, which gives you more money to act more quickly overall. And for all the flaws in the emissions trading scheme, for all the flaws in the Clean Development Mechanism has galvanized by mid-2012 $215 billion of investment, and is reckoned to have saved over $600 billion for countries fulfilling their Kyoto requirements. Now you contrast that with trying to mobilize the $100 billion a year for the Green Climate Fund, and you can see that markets can get there more quickly if you set them free. So I prefer not to mediate it through government, although I'm 35 years a bureaucrat myself. But I think as long as you do it and you try to design it properly and have the right relationship with other policy mechanisms, the most important thing is to do it.
Thanks very much. Any more questions? Maybe there's one more over here in the front. Please, wait for the microphone.
Sure. Hi, Jonas Manas, Nicholas Institute, Duke University. Jonathan, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned the need for more resources. And I'm wondering how you deal with the competition for resources in the climate change debate, where we need resources for adaptation in the international community. We need resources for these aspirational goals around clean energy. And at least in the United States, as you well know, we approach budget issues today from a position of presumed scarcity rather than presumed abundance. So how do you manage the competition there?
Well, I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I think we all grapple with this, and it's not only in this particular problem, it's across our economies where there are multiple priorities, and policymakers are faced with that decision. A lot of the issue is how do you maximize the resources you've got, and how do you allocate between the choices that you've got to make. So I would say a couple of things. I think you can maximize it if you are more efficient, if you can find multiple benefits, if you can look at programs that don't return only in one dimension, but return in multiple dimensions. And one of the things that's pretty interesting about the Clean Energy Ministerial and its initiatives is that it in fact does that. So you've got things that are not exclusively about climate change, which is attractive, but they are also about economic development. They are also about clean air. They're also about jobs. They're about training and capacity. So a set of these things that may be less attractive to one constituency but are attractive to another constituency, between the two of them, you now get both players in and the politics of both players. The second thing which I would say is that a number of the things that we're asking for, we're not going to buy this down. This is not a function of the government paying for a changed energy infrastructure. This is a function of modest catalytic money that will change people's behavior and people's investments. And I think we should be very clear, it is not that we have a shortcoming or a lack of money. It is that we haven't decided how to spend that money. So at the moment, for example, if you look at the International Energy Agency and the report that's been done by the Energy Technology Program, which did a report for the CEM at the last meeting, they looked at the various options for a much cleaner economy, one that had low, small footprints, and one that was more or less a business-as-usual economy that had a much higher footprint. The upfront capital was a bit more in the case of the lower footprint, but the long-term cost was a lot lower. So it's a question not of whether there's money, it's how you allocate it, how you distribute it, how you can catalyze it. There's money on the sidelines waiting to come in if we can find the way to reduce the risk. That, to me, is the way you think about it, and a way that engenders more enthusiasm for supporting the program. But Joan also probably has experience.
Yes, I think one of the things you mentioned, efficiency. I mean, this is run with a very low overhead. You know, there aren't kind of huge documents and negotiated texts, as Jonathan mentioned. So people are actually coming together and getting right down to work, and that's extremely important. The other thing is a lot of people are devoting their own resource. So there's a lot of private sector effort and resource going into thinking about these issues, to working them, taking them forward. And finally, I come back to the point that the investment will actually come from the private sector, but they just need to have confidence if they're looking at a project that it's not going to go out of fashion, that they're not going to be left with stranded assets because the political framework is going to change. So getting this dialogue going so they understand how that framework is going to evolve, what the likely timescale is, and where to start making their plans now to be able to respond. You know, if you were to say, for example, there'd be a mandation on a certain technology from 2015, 16 or whatever, private sector has to start investing now, has to start training the people, building the product lines and so on. And so it gives them early insight, and that in itself is valuable, but it also enables them to feed back those messages, which means that when you come up with what seems like a great contribution to lowering emissions, government isn't met with a very negative response of saying, well, yes, of course we'll do that because it's the law. We're physically not going to be able to do it for a few years. So you're opening up that planning process to the dialogue, and that's important in itself.
I think you've got some breadth and some sense of where things are from this discussion. Fortunately for all of you, this is not a process that's about to stop. The Energy Ministerial has its next meeting. The Koreans will be hosting it in Seoul this coming spring in the Northern Hemisphere, and we look forward to kind of a continuing dialogue. I think a lot of what we're going to be successful at is if we get input from you, if we get engagement, if we get participation. And so very much thanks to those of you who came here, those of you who might see the work online, and those of you who kind of provide feedback to us. So thanks for coming, and look forward to staying in touch.
Let's give one more round of applause to our speakers. And I'd just like to also take the time to let you know that in 30 minutes we have a presentation starting on the Hyperwall. We also have more presentations coming along this evening and tomorrow. So we hope that you come back to the U.S. Center to learn about various things, low emissions development strategies, short-lived climate pollutants. We're going to cover it all. So please come back and see us again. Thank you.